A war correspondent's greatest weapon, and at the same time his heaviest armor, is the camera in his hands. It immortalizes what he sees, turning his testimony into a frozen moment in history. The camera is the thin sheet of glass he puts between himself and reality. It's a shield that both thrusts him into the heart of the action and protects him from the emotional fallout. For James Walker, this shield was his very identity, forged in the fires of a deep and desperate hunger. He had run from the suffocating silence of his local newspaper in a sleepy Ohio town, a place where the biggest story of the week was a zoning dispute or the prize-winning pig at the county fair. He remembered the feeling perfectly, sitting at his wooden desk, staring out the window at the unchanging town square, feeling like his soul was slowly turning to dust. He craved life at its most raw, its most unfiltered. He wanted to see human nature for what it was when the thin veneer of civilization was scraped away. This hunger led him first to smaller conflicts, then to the place where the world's biggest fire was burning, Vietnam. His camera recorded everything: the brutal dance of steel and flesh, the bullets that mapped the geography of fear, the lives swallowed by mud and blood. But his story, his career, and his soul would not be defined by the thousands of unforgettable photos he took, but by the single frame he refused to capture. That was the moment his shield shattered, the moment hell looked straight into his eyes. When he landed in Saigon in 1968, he was an adrenaline junkie throwing himself into the eye of a storm. The city's chaos was, for him, the symphony of life. The air was a thick cocktail of smells: jasmine and diesel fumes, the sharp scent of Nuoc Mom fish sauce from street stalls, the metallic tang of approaching rain. The endless buzz of mopeds, the Western rock music spilling from smoky bars, and the wail of distant sirens, it all made him feel intensely alive. He was looking for the truth, and he was going to watch it from the front row, through the viewfinder of his Leica M2. At the rooftop bar of the Caravel Hotel, the unofficial clubhouse for the International Press Corps, he was surrounded by men just like him, only their souls were far more tired, their eyes clouded with a weariness that went bone deep. They drank to forget the things they had seen, the images burned onto their minds that no darkroom could ever develop. One of them, a veteran British journalist named Frank, whose face was a roadmap of forgotten conflicts from Korea to the Congo, raised his iced glass to James. "Fresh meat," he had grunted, a cynical smirk playing on his lips. "You've got the hunger in your eyes, kid. I recognize it. You think you're here to capture the truth, but there is no the truth here. There's just a million different truths, and they all end in screaming." He took a long swallow of his whiskey. "Let me give you some advice you won't ask for. Every picture you take has a price. Sometimes you pay it, sometimes the person in the frame pays it. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, is that you don't realize what that price is until long after you've pressed the shutter, when you're all alone in the dark with nothing but the ghosts you've captured on celluloid." At the time, James had dismissed the words as the cynical ramblings of a tired, drunk old man. He had sworn to himself that he would remain objective, a mere observer, an impartial scribe of history. But hell has its own morality, its own rules,
and it doesn't care about the vows of a stranger who comes to visit.
Soon enough, he found himself in the noisy, vibrating belly of a Huey helicopter, headed for a forward operating base known as Firebase Eagle's Nest, a dagger stuck into the heart of the untamed jungle. The rhythmic whump, whump, whump of the rotors beat the air from his lungs, the smell of hot metal and aviation fuel burning his nostrils. Most of the soldiers with him were just kids, 19 or 20, with barely a shadow of a beard on their faces, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bravado. For them, this was an order from their country, a tour of duty where they counted the days until they could go home. For James, it was the opportunity of a lifetime, the chance to capture that one single frame that would make his name. He didn't know yet that this green hell didn't just swallow bodies, it slowly, methodically devoured souls. His first 24 hours at the firebase were a full sensory assault. The moment the Huey skids touched the red dirt of the landing zone, a wave of oppressive heat and humidity hit him like a physical blow. The constant noise was a physical presence, the crackle and squawk of radios, the drone of overworked generators, the deep chest-thumping thud of distant artillery, and the incessant sound of helicopters that hung over everything, the soundtrack to this war. The air smelled of rotting sandbags, sweat and gunpowder and burning trash. He was introduced to the platoon's leader, Sergeant Kowalski, a man who looked like he'd been carved from oak, his face a mask of professional calm that didn't quite hide the exhaustion in his eyes. Kowalski looked James up and down, his gaze lingering on the clean fatigues and the shiny cameras. "Just try not to get in the way, Life magazine," he'd said, his voice a low gravel. "And don't get any of my men killed trying to get your perfect shot." The soldiers' gallows humor and dark jokes were the only defense mechanism they had against this absurd reality. Before he even went on his first patrol, James began to understand how different life was here from the theories he debated back in the air-conditioned bars of Saigon. His first weeks at Eagle's Nest passed in a sticky haze of humidity and paranoia. He began moving with Kowalski's platoon, the Ghosts, living as one of them. He learned the unique misery of leeches, the maddening buzz of mosquitoes, the gut-wrenching fear of a twig snapping in the dark. His Leica became a natural extension of his hand. He captured the mundane moments with the same passion as the tense ones, the lines on the young faces of soldiers as they cleaned their rifles with religious devotion, the trembling smoke of a shared cigarette after a false alarm, the 1,000-yard stares that took over during long, silent marches. He formed a particular connection with a young private from Texas named Miller. Miller was all innocence and wide-eyed hope, a stark contrast to the cynical world he'd been thrown into. He didn't just show James a worn-out photo of his family. At night, by the flickering light of a Zippo, he would whisper about the smell of the cornfields after a rainstorm, his father's calloused hands, and the last dance he'd had with his high school sweetheart, promising to be home by Christmas. "I'm going to take over my dad's farm when this hell is over, Mr. Walker," he'd said with an unshakable smile. "Gonna marry my girl, have a bunch of kids. You're lucky,
You just get to take a few pictures and leave." James had smiled, but the words now stuck in his mind like a fishhook. Just a few pictures. Was it really that simple? That night, as he sat up in his cot, awakened by the sound of indistinct explosions coming from deep within the jungle, he felt for the first time that the cold metal of his camera was not a comfort, but a splinter digging into his soul. But this was only the beginning of the horror, the prelude to the confrontation that would tear his soul apart.
The jungle had swallowed them. A violent monsoon rain emptied the sky like a torn sack, turning the paths into rivers of thick, red mud. James slogged through it with the ghosts. The confident journalist from Saigon was a distant memory. His face was gaunt with exhaustion and tension, his eyes constantly scanning the dark, suffocating walls of green on either side. His objectivity was, without him realizing it, turning into empathy. They were no longer soldiers in a statistic. They were Miller, who hummed off-key country songs under his breath. Jackson, the stoic black machine gunner who carried the massive M60 as if it were a toy. Diaz, the quiet radio man from the Bronx who read and reread letters from home until they fell apart. And Doc O'Brien, the medic who cursed constantly, but whose hands were gentle and sure. James was recording their whispers, their fears, the brief light that spread across their faces when they talked about home, not with his camera, but with his mind. The ambush came like a scream tearing through the jungle's oppressive silence. The deafening chatter of an AK-47 ripped the air apart from their left flank, instantly met by the frantic roar of M16s. James instinctively threw himself to the ground, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a moment, with his face pressed into the mud, all he saw were large raindrops hitting the earth, creating tiny craters. Then, his training, his purpose, kicked in. He raised his camera. Through the viewfinder, the world became a framed, terrifying chaos. Muzzle flashes flickered in the gloom. Bullets tore splinters from tree trunks, sounding like angry wasps buzzing past his ear. It was then that he saw the sharpest, most brutal frame of his life. 10 yards away, a young soldier he knew as PFC Henderson fell to the ground, crying out in pain as he clutched a leg that was suddenly soaked in blood. Doc O'Brien, without a moment's hesitation, scrambled toward him, ignoring Kowalski's yells to stay down. Just as he reached the wounded soldier, Doc jerked as if pushed by an invisible hand, and a red flower bloomed on his back. James's finger was on the shutter. His mind was screaming at him, "Shoot! This is it! The shot! The heroism, the sacrifice, the tragedy of war in one frame! This was the photo that would win him the Pulitzer, the one that would define his career." Frank's words echoed in his head. Every picture has a price. In that instant, he understood the price. To turn another man's agony, another man's final act of courage, into an object for his own glory. His finger froze. The professional inside him fought a desperate battle with the man, the human being, who was watching another human being die. He couldn't do it. In that moment, time slowed down for James. The voices in his head went silent. All he saw was Doc's face, contorted in pain, and his hand still trying to reach the other soldier. He was suspended in the abyss between recording a story and participating in its tragedy. He slowly lowered his camera, letting it rest in the mud. He crawled, pushing Doc's medical bag toward him. That day, for the first time, instead of being the author of a story, he became one of its bloody, helpless characters. And at that exact moment, a mortar shell landed nearby, and the world dissolved into a deafening roar and a flash of white light.
When the ringing in his ears faded and the shockwave passed, all that was left was the smell of cordite, the silence of death, and the groans of the wounded. James was alive, without a scratch on him, but something inside him was irreparably broken. The thin, sacred line between observer and participant had been forever stained with mud and blood. The battle had been won, the ambush repelled, but the cost was horrific. Doc O'Brien had died before they could get him to the evac chopper. So had Henderson. And Miller, the sweet kid from Texas, had been caught by the same mortar blast that had nearly taken James. There was nothing left but a dog tag and a scorched wallet containing a half-melted photograph of his family. The detail that would replay in James's mind, stealing his sleep for years to come, was the sight of Kowalski, the tough-as-nails sergeant, kneeling in the mud, carefully putting that dog tag into his own pocket. The only photograph James took after he came to his senses was of the small, crumpled family photo lying in the mud next to Doc's bloodied hand. It was the most personal and painful picture he had ever taken. James Walker was never the same person after that ambush. He was no longer an adrenaline hunter. He was a ghost, crushed under the weight of the memories he carried. At night, when he managed to sleep, the explosions and the faces of Doc and Miller haunted his dreams. During the day, he moved like an automaton, not speaking, just staring with empty eyes. He tried to type a dispatch about what had happened, to put into words the bravery and the waste, but the words felt like ashes in his mouth. He sat for an hour in front of his typewriter, the blank page mocking him. How could you describe the sound a boy makes when his dreams of a Texas farm are extinguished in a flash of light? How could you capture the weight of a dog tag in a sergeant's hand? His camera felt impossibly heavy. Its click, once the sound of triumph, now sounded like a bone snapping in his soul. He was completely drained when he joined his last mission, an operation they called a sweep and clear. The intelligence was shaky. A single informant claiming a small village was being used as a Viet Cong supply depot. Kowalski had argued against it, calling it a fool's errand, but the orders from on high were clear. The mood in the platoon was dark and vengeful. They had lost too much. They were looking for payback. When they entered the village, they were met only by the frightened eyes of old men, women, and children. The air smelled less of gunpowder and more of cooking rice, wood smoke, and a deep, pervasive fear. The soldiers were on edge, their fingers tight on their triggers. James photographed the scene mechanically, the face of a crying child, the praying hands of an old woman, but he felt nothing anymore. His camera had become a soulless machine of testimony. In the doorway, shredded by bullets, stood a boy of about 10, with a toy wooden rifle in his hand and a look of utter shock and terror in his wide, dark eyes. The photo that summarized the entire senselessness of war, all its tragedy, all its slaughter of innocents, was right there in front of him. History was at his fingertips. A part of his mind, the professional, was screaming, "Shoot! The world needs to see this. This is the truth." But another voice, born in the mud beside Doc O'Brien, rose from the depths of his soul. He saw Doc's face. He saw Miller's innocent smile. He saw the pieces of his own spirit that he had left behind in the jungle. Slowly, deliberately, in an act of final defiance against the hunger that had brought him here, he lowered his camera. He took his eye away from the viewfinder and, with his naked, unprotected eyes, he absorbed all the pain of that moment, letting it sear itself into his memory. That photo was never taken. The proof of that moment never made the front page of any newspaper, never hung on the wall of any gallery. But it was etched into James Walker's memory, into the darkest room of his soul, forever. He understood on that muddy village road that day that some truths are too big to fit through a lens, some pain too vast to be trapped in a picture frame. And sometimes the bravest, most important thing a man can do is not to bear witness to history, but simply to remain human within it. James Walker left Vietnam after that mission. He never set foot in a war zone again. He left behind hundreds of powerful photographs that bore witness to history, photos that brought him awards and fame. But years later, in the dim quiet of his house in Ohio, as he looked at those famous photos hanging on his wall, his eyes would always drift to the empty wooden frame that sat on his desk. That empty frame was his most powerful story. Frank had been right. Every photo had a price. By not taking his most important picture, James had paid the heaviest price of all, the curse of never being able to forget. That frame was the immortal monument to that silent moment, to the photograph that was never taken, to the choice of a man who, instead of capturing the truth, chose to save his own humanity.